Welcome to the Right News Network.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emma with the headlines that matter most right now. Trump just issued the starkest warning yet to Iran. He's telling Tehran there won't be anything left of them if they don't move fast on a peace deal. 80 days into this conflict, and negotiations are completely stalled. Our Middle East correspondent Layla Nazari is tracking what comes next. Layla, walk us through what triggered this ultimatum right now.
Yeah, Emma. And the timing is significant. What I'm hearing from sources in the region is that the White House has basically run out of patience. Iran presented new proposals about a week ago, and the Americans looked at them this weekend and decided they weren't concrete enough, weren't moving toward the terms Washington wants. Trump's message today? Either Tehran gets serious in the next few weeks, or military operations resume at a much larger scale.
So when Trump says the clock is ticking, he actually means it?
Absolutely. What's striking here is that this isn't rhetorical anymore. Senior officials I spoke with this morning made clear that the administration has set an internal deadline. We're talking before the end of the month. The military is prepared. The diplomatic window they're describing is, frankly, Emma, very narrow now.
Layla Nazari, thanks for being on this. Remaining with world affairs, Ukraine just pulled off one of its most ambitious strikes inside Russia. At least 4 people dead in and around Moscow after overnight drone attacks. Our defense correspondent Marcus Webb is tracking the implications. Marcus, this is being called the largest Ukrainian attack on the capital region in over a year. What changed?
Yeah, Emma. And it's not just the scale. What I'm hearing from military analysts is that Ukraine's showing a fundamentally different capability now. They're striking hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory with precision. An Indian worker was killed in this attack, civilian casualties, but the targets themselves appear to have been military infrastructure and an airport. The message here is clear. Nowhere in Russia is safe anymore.
Does Moscow have any answer to this?
Look, that's the uncomfortable question for the Kremlin right now. Their air defenses are clearly overwhelmed. And here's what's striking to me. Russia's response historically has been to hit back harder at Ukrainian cities, but they're also doing something else. Intelligence reports suggest they're pressuring university students to enlist as drone pilots. That tells you they're feeling the manpower crunch. They're scrambling.
Marcus Webb, thanks. Still on world, the death toll from executions worldwide just hit a 44-year high, and it's one country driving almost everything. Layla rejoins me now. Layla, Iran alone accounts for how much of this global number? Yeah, Emma, nearly 80%. Out of 2,707 confirmed executions globally last year, 2,159 were in Iran. That's an extraordinary concentration of capital punishment in a single state. What's striking here is the timing. Amnesty International found that executions accelerated significantly after the February 28th military strikes, which suggests this wasn't random. This looks deliberate. So Iran ramped up executions after those strikes. What changed on the ground? Well, what I'm hearing from human rights monitors in the region is that authorities use the regional military tension as political cover to intensify domestic repression, specifically against political prisoners and dissidents. The UN verified at least 32 political executions since February alone, and frankly, Emma, that pattern, using external crisis justification for internal crackdown, that's a playbook we've seen before, but the scale here is unprecedented for a single calendar year. Numbers like that demand accountability. Layla, appreciate it. Also on the world front, China's just agreed to buy billions of dollars worth of American farm goods, $17 billion, every single year. Marcus rejoins me now. Marcus, what's driving this commitment from Beijing right now?
Yeah, Emma, and this comes straight out of Trump's China trip last week. What's significant here is the specificity. We're not talking vague promises. The White House put out a fact sheet Sunday detailing annual purchase targets. I was speaking to agricultural analysts this morning who told me this could fundamentally reshape commodity markets, soybeans especially.
But is China actually committed to this, or is there wiggle room?
Look, that's the trillion-dollar question, frankly. The White House says at least $17 billion, which suggests they built in some flexibility. What's striking is that Beijing hasn't issued a matching statement with the same hard numbers. They're talking more broadly about trade cooperation and tariff discussions. So we've got two sides describing the same summit in pretty different terms, and that gap, that's where real problems could emerge.
Marcus, thanks. A deadly Ebola outbreak just declared a global health emergency. The WHO made it official Sunday, nearly 250 cases, 80 deaths, and it's spreading across Congo and Uganda. We turn now to our Africa correspondent, Nina Okonkwo. Nina, how bad is this situation on the ground right now?
Yeah, Emma. And this is significant because we're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet. I was speaking to health officials this morning who described the situation as extremely concerning but contained, at least for now. What makes this outbreak different is where it's happening. Ituri province is a conflict zone. You've got armed groups, displacement camps, very limited healthcare infrastructure. The Bundibugyo strain they're dealing with, it's serious, but it spreads slower than other variants, which gives them a window to respond.
Why are Americans being evacuated? That suggests things are moving pretty fast.
Look, the U.S. doesn't pull people out lightly. The fact that at least 6 Americans have been exposed tells you this is real, and it's spreading in ways that matter internationally. The concern, frankly, isn't just medical, it's logistical. If this breaks containment in a conflict zone where you can't reach people, that's when it becomes unmanageable. And frankly, Emma, that's what keeps public health officials awake at night.
Nina Okonkwo, thanks for the reporting. The Middle East conflict has already drained $25 billion from the global economy, and that's just the start. We're talking about nearly 280 companies cutting production, raising prices, bracing for worse. The damage is showing up in your mortgage payments right now, even though interest rates haven't moved. Here's what's at stake. These aren't abstract numbers. They're feeding into inflation that hits working families directly. And diplomatically, here's the twist. Iran and the U.S. say they're still talking. But yesterday, drones hit Saudi Arabia and the UAE again. So the question becomes, can mediators actually hold this together, or are we watching a ceasefire that's already coming apart? Tonight, a major counterterrorism operation. U.S. forces and Nigerian military have killed what President Trump is calling the Islamic State's second-in-command. His name is Abu Bilal Manuki, and Trump says he was the most active terrorist in the world. The strike happened at a compound in the Lake Chad Basin. It's a significant win for counterterrorism operations in West Africa. But here's the reality. ISIS has shown it can survive even when losing top leaders. The question now is whether this operation marks the beginning of something bigger. The Persian Gulf is in focus tonight, and it's not just military leaders who are sounding alarms. Finance ministers from the world's largest economies are meeting in Paris right now, and they're talking about something that could hit your wallet. Our technology correspondent Alex Park has been tracking the economic angle. Alex, what's driving this sudden alarm from G7 officials?
Yeah, Emma. And this is significant because we're not just talking about regional tension anymore. What I'm hearing from sources close to these discussions is that prolonged uncertainty around the Persian Gulf, whether it's shipping disruptions or geopolitical escalation, is already pushing up borrowing costs globally. That translates to higher interest rates for everything from mortgages to business loans. One senior finance official told me this morning that even the threat of closure is enough to spook markets.
So why is Senator Graham pushing for military action right now?
Look, his argument is straightforward. He's saying the status quo isn't working, that the current stalemate is hurting everyone economically and strategically. From his perspective, stronger US military presence sends a signal that we're not going to tolerate indefinite disruption. But here's where it gets complicated. That same escalation could trigger the very crisis everyone's trying to prevent.
Alex Park, thanks. Moving to business now, Europe's got a major problem in its race to compete with America and China on artificial intelligence. The issue isn't talent or ambition, it's power, literally. Our Asia correspondent James Chen has been tracking how energy costs are reshaping the tech competition. James, how bad is this energy gap?
Yeah, Emma, and it's worse than most people realize. We're not talking about a modest price difference here. Energy costs across Europe vary so wildly that you're actually seeing two completely separate AI markets emerging. Countries that can afford to build data centers and countries that simply can't. I was speaking with industry analysts this morning who said some European nations are getting priced out entirely while others are becoming hubs. That's a recipe for fracturing the continent's tech sector right down the middle.
So which countries are winning and which are losing?
Look, it comes down to power generation. Countries with abundant hydroelectric or nuclear capacity are attracting massive investment. But nations dependent on more expensive sources, they're watching companies take their AI operations elsewhere. And frankly, Emma, that's a permanent decision. Once a company builds a data center in a cheap power region, they're not moving it. The competitive advantage becomes locked in.
James Chen, thanks for that reporting. A terrifying moment captured on video at an air show in Idaho Sunday. Two Navy fighter jets collided mid-air during a public performance, and here's what matters right now. All 4 pilots got out safely. They ejected in time, they're in stable condition, but the incident has reopened an old debate about military aviation displays and the risks they pose to both performers and spectators. We're learning tonight that the collision happened during the Gunfighter Skies air show at Mountain Home Air Force Base. The base locked down immediately. The rest of the show was canceled. And now investigators are digging into how 2 highly trained pilots in multi-million-dollar aircraft ended up on a collision course.
Time to go deeper. Beyond the headlines, our full analysis of the story shaping the world right now.
Two United States Navy EA-18G Growler jets, sophisticated frontline electronic warfare aircraft, collided mid-air on Sunday at the Gunfighter Skies air show at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho. All 4 crew members ejected and are reported to be in stable condition, which is frankly miraculous given what those videos show. The base was locked down, the show canceled, and 2 aircraft worth somewhere north of $130 million are now wreckage on the ground. The Navy has confirmed an investigation is underway, but the harder questions about American military readiness are already being asked, or should be. Joining me now are Alex Park, our technology and science analyst, and Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst. Alex, let me start with you. Is this a freak accident, or is this a symptom of something much more alarming about the state of American air power?
Thanks, Emma. Look, the instinct is to say, everyone survived, thank goodness, let's move on. And I understand that instinct, but I think it is profoundly dangerous to indulge it. These are EA-18G Growlers, not training aircraft, not aging platforms. These are the Navy's premier electronic warfare jets, the aircraft you need on day one of any serious conflict with China or a near-peer adversary to suppress enemy air defenses. Losing 2 of them in a single peacetime incident is not a footnote. The US Navy has roughly 160 of these in its entire inventory. That fleet is not being rapidly expanded. And when you look at what the GAO and Pentagon readiness reports have been saying for years, below target availability rates, maintenance backlogs, parts shortages, you have to ask whether this collision is the visible tip of a much larger readiness iceberg. Douglas Murray would say, and I think he'd be right, that institutions reveal their true condition not in their best moments, but in their worst ones. This is one of those moments, is that a military with its priorities correctly ordered does not lose 2 frontline aircraft at a Sunday afternoon air show.
But, Alex, devil's advocate here, mid-air collisions have happened throughout the history of military aviation. Even the best-funded, best trained air forces in the world have had these incidents. Isn't there a real risk of overreading one accident, however dramatic, as evidence of systemic failure? And Marcus, what's your take on this?
Well, look, Emma is raising a fair point, and frankly, I think Alex is jumping to conclusions a little too fast here. Mid-air collisions during complex formation air show maneuvers are not unheard of, and I'm not going to sit here and declare a readiness crisis on the basis of one incident before a single line of the investigation report has been written. What I will say is this: the data does give me pause. The 2017 Fitzgerald and McCain collisions, 17 dead, were traced to systemic training failures in the surface Navy. That should be a standing reminder that when the military closes ranks and manages messaging, the real problems don't get fixed. What I want to see here is full transparency from the Navy, genuine congressional oversight, and none of the bureaucratic self-protection that typically follows an embarrassing incident. The financial loss alone, somewhere around $150 million in destroyed hardware, demands an honest accounting to the American taxpayer.
I hear what Marcus is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. We're not talking about a random equipment failure on a routine training flight. This happened in front of a civilian crowd, at an air show, in a carefully briefed, pre-planned performance. These crews knew the exact maneuvers they were supposed to execute, and yet two of them ended up in the same piece of sky. That doesn't happen without something going wrong at a level deeper than one bad day. I've looked at the readiness numbers. Naval aviation squadrons have been operating below target thresholds. Training hours have been compressed. Parts availability has been a documented headache. You do not get to dismiss those data points just because the investigation hasn't reported yet. Tucker Carlson has been hammering this point for years, that when you divide institutional attention and compress training budgets, you get outcomes. This is an outcome.
Here's what I want to know, because both of you keep gesturing at the investigation as the crucial next step. But we've seen how these Pentagon investigations play out. Months of silence, heavily redacted reports, no one held accountable. Where does this actually go from here? And does Congress have either the appetite or the access to force genuine answers? Marcus, where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out, the Navy's initial investigation findings will take 3 to 6 months, and the first instinct of the institutional bureaucracy will be to frame this as a procedural anomaly, identify a narrow technical or communications failure, implement a targeted fix, and declare the matter resolved. That is almost certainly not the full story, and the risk is that a compliant media lets them get away with it. The key watchdog here has to be Congress, specifically Senator Tom Cotton and the Senate Armed Services Committee. Cotton has shown he's willing to ask the questions that make Pentagon officials uncomfortable. If he and his colleagues don't press hard and publicly for the readiness data underlying this incident, not just the accident report, but the broader aviation availability numbers, then this becomes another managed embarrassment rather than a genuine accountability moment.
Here's what concerns me most, and this is the scenario that keeps serious defense analysts awake at night. If this investigation produces the narrow, self-protective findings Marcus is describing, and if the readiness issues that may underlie this accident are not addressed, then the trajectory suggests the next significant failure will not be at a Sunday afternoon air show in front of families eating hot dogs. It will be in a contested environment, over the Taiwan Strait, or in the Persian Gulf, or wherever the next serious confrontation with a near-peer adversary occurs. And at that point, the cost will not be measured in dollars or in embarrassing video footage. History tells us that militaries which do not honestly diagnose their peacetime failures tend to discover their full magnitude in combat. That is the real stakes here, and everyone from the Secretary of the Navy down to the congressional oversight committees needs to understand that.
Alex Park and Marcus Webb, genuinely important analysis, and it's clear this story is far from over. 2 growlers in the Idaho dirt is the visible part. What's beneath the surface is the question that matters. The crews survived. Now, let's find out if the institution has the honesty to do the same. The World Health Organization has just declared the Ebola outbreak in Congo and Uganda a public health emergency of international concern, its highest alarm level short of a full pandemic declaration. We're talking about 246 suspected cases, up to 88 deaths, a strain of Ebola for which there is no approved vaccine, and at least 6 Americans already exposed in the field. The CDC is now running active extraction operations to get American nationals out of the affected zone. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is the WHO's response actually adequate here? Or are we watching the same institutional slow-motion disaster we've seen before?
Thanks, Emma. And the honest answer is, it looks worryingly familiar. Let's be clear about what happened here. The Telegraph is reporting that this virus was likely spreading undetected for 3 weeks before anyone officially raised the alarm. 3 weeks. In a conflict zone, with a strain that has no vaccine. The WHO has now issued its declaration. And yes, that triggers international protocols, but the question serious people should be asking is why the detection infrastructure failed so badly in the first place. Tedros and the WHO have spent years promising reformed, faster response mechanisms after the COVID catastrophe. And yet here we are, potentially 3 weeks behind the curve on an outbreak in one of the most porous, conflict-ridden border regions on the planet. Douglas Murray has argued for years that Western institutions have a consistent, dangerous habit of prioritizing their own institutional reputations over honest, urgent communication. And this situation has all the hallmarks of exactly that pattern. The fact that American citizens have been exposed and are now being extracted by the CDC is not a minor footnote. That should be the headline. And I would argue the Biden-era dismantling of pandemic preparedness infrastructure and frankly, the chronic underfunding of biosecurity frameworks under multiple administrations has left the West dangerously exposed to precisely this kind of scenario.
But, Sophia, isn't it unfair to dump this on the WHO specifically when we're talking about a conflict zone where no international body has easy access? You can't exactly send inspectors into active armed conflict. And James, what's your take on this? Are we really facing a global threat here, or is the media framing outpacing the actual risk?
Well, look, I think Sophia's instinct on the WHO is right, but she's landing on the wrong diagnosis. The problem isn't just the WHO's communication culture. It's the fundamental economic and structural reality of how the world invests or doesn't invest in diseases that primarily affect poor, conflict-affected regions. The Bundibugyo strain has been known since 2007, nearly 20 years. And there's still no approved vaccine. Why? Because the pharmaceutical economics simply don't incentivize it. There's no commercial return on a vaccine for a disease that clusters in war zones in Central Africa. That's a genuine specific market failure, and it's one that requires strategic state-level investment decisions that neither the US, nor the EU, nor the broader international community has been willing to make. The 2007 Bundibugyo outbreak had a case fatality rate of around 34%. We're seeing comparable numbers now. That data was sitting in the scientific literature for almost 2 decades. The risk here is that we spend all our energy attacking the WHO while missing the structural investment failures that created this vulnerability in the first place.
I hear what James is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. Yes, the vaccine investment failure is real. Yes, it's a structural problem, but we are where we are right now, today. 6 Americans have been exposed. The CDC is running extraction operations, and the system that was supposed to catch this early failed. You can't address structural investment failures in the next 48 hours. You can demand that the institutions we fund, that we have poured billions into, actually do their jobs with urgency. The WHO had reformed protocols. They had promised faster response, and they were still 3 weeks behind the virus. That's not a market failure. That's an institutional failure. Full stop. And the idea that we soften that criticism because the geography is difficult, I'm sorry, but that's exactly the kind of excuse-making that got us into trouble with COVID, and I'm not buying it this time.
Here's what I want to know. 6 Americans exposed, active extraction underway, a virus with no vaccine spreading through a region that borders multiple countries. Where does this go in the next 60 to 90 days? James, where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out there are really two critical variables. First, can Uganda's emergency response actually hold the line at the border? Uganda has a meaningfully stronger health system than DRC, and if they can implement effective isolation and contact tracing, the probability of a broader regional spread drops significantly. Second, and this is the one I'm watching closely, the extraction and quarantine of exposed Americans will be a real-time test of whether the post-COVID preparedness investments actually translated into operational capability or just talking points. If the CDC manages this cleanly, it actually tells us something reassuring about Western institutional capacity. If it gets messy, if there are protocol failures, if the quarantine infrastructure isn't where it needs to be, that's the scenario that gets very uncomfortable very fast.
Here's what concerns me most. The thing James isn't fully accounting for is the conflict variable. Ituri province isn't just geographically remote, it's actively contested. Armed groups operate throughout that region. Health workers have been attacked in previous DRC Ebola outbreaks. Contact tracing requires community cooperation, and you cannot build community cooperation in a war zone on a 48-hour timeline. If this virus smolders in areas that are effectively ungoverned, which much of Ituri functionally is, we could be looking at a months-long grinding regional crisis rather than a clean containment story. And the trajectory suggests that the 3-week detection gap we've already seen could repeat itself in new cluster areas. That's the scenario that should be dominating every security briefing in Washington and London right now, and I'd wager it isn't.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen, a sobering and essential conversation. One thing is certain. A virus that had a 3-week head start, no vaccine, and an active war zone to hide in doesn't care how long the WHO's committee meetings take.
That wraps up today's top stories. I'm Emma. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.